The Duke of Harcliffe was standing at the long window of the estate room with the Navy Board's letter open in his hand when she asked him for 5 minutes on the subject of his trees. And he did not give her the 5 minutes. He gave her a look of the kind a tired man gives a piece of furniture that has unaccountably spoken. And then he turned to Mr. Quincy, the purveyor, a broad, comfortable gentleman in a snuff-colored coat who stood warming his back at the fire as though the fire were owed to him, and he said it to Quince and not to her. What can a governess know of oak? And Quince laughed the small, easy laugh of a man being agreed with, and Verity Holt stood in the middle of the estate room with her father's brass-handled timber auger wrapped in flannel under her arm like an infant nobody would look at, and understood that the interview was over before it had begun. She made her curtsy, because a governess curtsies, and she went out past the steward, Mr. Druitt, who held the door for her with beautiful manners and eyes like a ledger, and she walked back through the wet park to the schoolroom in the east wing, and the great oaks of Harcliffe Chase stood on either side of her the whole way, 1,100 of them and more, 2 centuries old and 3, their bare crowns working in the January wind, every third one of them wearing the purveyor's condemning scribe mark slashed white into its bark like a word spoken over a sick bed, and not one of them, so far as Verity Holt could tell, and she could tell, was sick at all. That was January in the year 1812, with the war eating ships faster than England could grow them. And it is worth telling you now, before we go back and take the whole of it in order, that on Lady Day of that same year, the 25th of March, in the timber yard by the saw pits with half the county watching, that same Duke would kneel in the mud in his good coat beside a fresh felled oak with his own shirt sleeve turned back, boring into the butt of it with that same brass-handled auger while a governess counted the turns for him, and that he would lift the pale, unbroken shaving of it into the light with his own fingers. Sound heartwood, sweet as a nut through and through, out of a tree the king's purveyor had condemned in writing as rotten to the ground, and that he would stay kneeling there a long moment with the shaving across his palm, not because he did not understand what it meant, but because he understood everything it meant, about his forest and his steward, and the comfortable man in the snuff-colored coat, and the woman he had not given 5 minutes to in January. But that was Lady Day, and this was January, and between the two of them lies the whole of this story. She was 26 that winter, and she had been at Harcliffe Hall not quite 2 years, governess to the 2 orphaned children of the Duke's late cousin, a grave small boy and a fierce small girl, who lived at the hall because there was nowhere else for them to live, in the way of children swept into the corners of great houses. She had come to teaching the way most governesses come to it, down a staircase of griefs, and hers had begun in the most unlikely schoolroom in England, the Royal Dockyard at Chatham, where her father, Daniel Holt, had been 35 years a shipwright, and had ended a master shipwright's right hand, the man the master sent for when a question of timber could not be answered by the book. Daniel Holt had no son, and he had a daughter who followed him from the time she could walk, through the saw pits and the seasoning sheds and the mast ponds and the great stacked cathedrals of waiting oak. And he was a man who could not keep knowledge to himself any more than a lamp can keep light. And so, without either of them ever once calling it teaching, he taught her. He taught her that a ship of the line is a forest that has agreed to float 2,000 loads of oak and more in the body of a first rate, and that every load of it must be sound, because a hidden rot in one knee of a warship is 100 drowned men 10 years on. He taught her to read a standing tree the way other men read a page, crown and bark and bud, the set of the limbs, the ring of a mallet laid against the trunk, sound wood answering clean and hard, doted wood answering dull, like a cracked bell, like a consumptive's chest, and the auger last of all, the slender bright bite of it turning slow into the heart of a 200-year-old life, and the shaving it brought out telling you the truth of the inside as honestly as a surgeon's probe, pale and firm and smelling of tannin and clean earth if the tree was sound, soft and foxy brown and smelling of mushroom if the rot had got in. She could sound a tree at 10 years old. She could judge a shaving at 12, and grade a whole parcel of standing timber at 17. And her father would set her judgment against a purveyor's for the sport of it, and the purveyor did not always win, and none of it was worth a farthing to her as a livelihood, because His Majesty's Navy did not buy timber from young women, and the world had no shelf on which such a knowledge and such a keeping could be set. Then, inside 18 months, the staircase of griefs, her father crushed lame by a rolling balk that a drunken foreman had stacked green, and pensioned off small, and dead of the lameness and the smallness inside a year, and the little house at Chatham given up, and Verity Holt, 23, with a head full of the king's oak and no honest use for it, discovered what the daughters of dead craftsmen discover, that she was qualified for exactly one respectable trade, and so she taught, first in a merchant's villa at Rochester, and then on a good character at Harcliffe Hall, 40 miles inland, in the green heavy heart of the Shires, where she arrived on a June evening and looked out of the carriage window at the Chase rolling away from the road in every direction, and felt something in her chest go quiet for the first time since the dockyard, because Harcliffe Chase was the thing she had been raised to reverence and had never seen whole, one of the last great oak forests in private hands in England, planted by the Duke's forebears when the Armada was living memory, 1,100 massed worthy oaks, and thousands of lesser stuff besides, the kind of standing timber the Navy Board dreamed of at night and mostly dreamed in vain, because the great families would sooner mortgage their souls than fell their fathers' trees. The Duke of Harcliffe was 30 years old that winter, and he had been Duke for 3. And the truth of his situation, which the county suspected in outline and he knew to the last brutal figure, was this: his father had been a splendid, warm, extravagant, catastrophic man who had loved building and horses and hospitality and had understood money the way a child understands fire, as a bright thing other people were tiresome about. And he had died leaving the estate mortgaged past its rents, and the young Duke had spent 3 years selling what could be sold and closing what could be. Closed and learning at an age when other men learned dancing the particular cold arithmetic of a great inheritance going down. And at the bottom of that arithmetic, the one asset that was whole, unmortgaged, and immense, stood the Chase. His grandfather's entail had guarded the timber, the lawyers had freed it at last, and the war had done the rest. For by 1812 the Navy's hunger for great oak was past all supplying, and a contract to furnish the king's yards from a forest like Harcliffe Chase was worth, over the term of it, upwards of £60,000, enough to clear the mortgages, fund the estate, and set the dukedom on honest ground for a generation. One survey stood between the Duke and that deliverance. The Navy did not buy timber unseen. And so, in the last week of November, there had come down from London Mr. Nathaniel Quincy, purveyor, the board's man for the Midland Shires, with his chainmen and his scribes and his marking iron, to walk the Chase and judge the timber and certify to the board what Harcliffe oak was worth. And in the second week of January Mr. Quince had delivered his judgment, and his judgment was a sentence of death. The Chase, said Quince's certificate in beautiful round clerk's language, was a ruin, wearing a crown, outwardly noble, inwardly gone. Ring shake through the older stands, dote and foxiness in the heartwood, the fatal star shake in butt after butt, of 1,100 trees surveyed. not 140 fit for the king's yards, and those the smallest and the meanest, the rest fit for tanbark, firewood, and the lesser country trades. And the board was advised, with regret, to decline the parcel entire. A forest that half the county had envied for 200 years was, by the stroke of a purveyor's pen, worth not 60,000 pounds, but something nearer 4. And the Duke, who could not read the inside of a tree and had never needed to, because reading the inside of things was what one paid the king's officers to do, took the certificate the way a man takes a diagnosis out of a great physician's mouth, with horror and with belief. It never once occurred to him to doubt it. It is the whole hinge of this story that it never once occurred to him to doubt it, and we shall stop on that hinge presently. But first you must see what came through the door 11 days behind the certificate, because the timing is the confession, if anyone in that grieving house had been cold enough to read it. What came through the door was an offer. Alderman Thomas Crake, of the city of Worcester, timber merchant and contractor, a person the Duke had never met, wrote most respectfully to say that he had heard, as men in the trade hear things, of his Grace's disappointment, that condemned parcels were, as it happened, his particular business, that standing firewood and bark in such quantity, at such a distance from water carriage, would be a heavy speculation for any man, but that out of respect for the house of Harcliffe he would take the entire chase as it stood, every stick, at 4,500 pounds, money down, the fall to begin within the month. And Mr. Druitt, the steward, carrying the letter to his master, observed gravely that it was a bitter thing, but that 4,500 pounds of ready money was 4,500 pounds, that the mortgages would not wait upon sentiment, and that a dead forest, like any other corpse, did not improve by keeping. Now it is worth stopping, as I promised on the hinge, on why a clever and not at all trusting man believed the certificate with his whole heart. When a house is struck by a thing it cannot read, a lawsuit, a disease, a debt, a forest, it does not send for the truth, it sends for the one man who says, calmly, I understand this. Leave it with me. And whatever that man then says becomes, for the stricken house, not an opinion but the weather. Mr. Quince was the king's own officer, 25 years in the timber trade, his certificate stamped with the board's authority, and behind Quince, nearer and softer, stood Mr. Caleb Druitt, who had been steward at Harcliffe for 6 years, who had come to the old Duke with excellent references out of a great house in the north, and who had made himself, through the long collapse and the long salvage, the channel through which every difficult thing passed, the mortgages, the sales, the creditors, the rents, until the young Duke, who trusted no one on principle, trusted Druitt by exhaustion, which is the way most trust is actually built. Druitt had stood at the Duke's elbow through every amputation of those 3 years, always grave, always regretful, always ready with the figure and the buyer, and if any man had thought to lay those amputations end to end and notice how often the buyer at the far end of some chain of respectable names connected to interests in Worcester, no man did, because the steward kept the books, and the books balanced beautifully, because he kept them. What Verity Holt knew of all this that January was only what a governess knows, which is everything and nothing. The shape of trouble through doors, the servants' hall reading the house the way sailors read a sky, the children asking her at lessons why the men had put white marks on the climbing oak by the mere, and whether the trees had done something wrong. But what Verity Holt knew that nobody else in the county knew, she had learned on her own 2 feet, because for 2 years the Chase had been her Sunday church and her evening parlor, She had walked it in every weather with the children and without them, out of homesickness at first, because a dockyard child among oaks is at least among her own congregation, and then out of plain love. And she had done in those 2 years, idly, for no reason on earth but that her hands and eyes were her father's, what she had been raised to do among great timber. She had listened to it. She knew the chase tree by tree, the way a shepherd knows faces in a flock that all look alike to visitors. She had sounded 100 of them, with the little mallet she carried on her walks the way other women carry a sketching block, and heard the clean hard ring of sound heartwood come back off 90 of the 100. She had read crowns and bark seams through 4 seasons. She had bored, with her father's auger, discreetly, low on the butt, where the plug of moss she pressed back would hide the wound, perhaps 30 trees in 2 years, for the pure pleasure of hearing her father's voice in her head grading the shaving, and she carried the whole of that knowledge folded up small inside her, the way you carry a language nobody around you speaks. So that when the word ran through the house in January that the king's surveyor had found the chase rotten through, ring shake, dote, star shake, not 1 tree in 8 worth the felling, Verity Holt stood at the schoolroom window looking out at 1,100 old lives she had listened to with her own ears, and she did not think how dreadful the way the house thought it. She thought, in her father's flat dockyard voice, that is not true. And she was as certain of it as she was of her own name, and her certainty was worth exactly nothing, because it lived in the head of a governess, and the falsehood lived on a certificate of the Navy Board, and she was her father's daughter enough to know precisely how that arithmetic came out. She did not go to the Duke that first week. She went to the trees. She took her mallet and her auger and the children's nature walks and her own Sundays, and she worked the marked stands methodically, as her father would have, not sampling her favorites but crossing the purveyor's judgment tree by condemned tree. And by the end of a fortnight, she had found the thing that turned her cold certainty colder, because it turned a wrong survey into something no survey could be by honest accident. The marks were not mistaken. The marks were inverted. Tree after great tree that her mallet rang sound, and her auger proved sound, pale firm shavings, sweet through the heart at 4 feet of depth, wore the white slash of condemnation. And meanwhile, of the modest 140 that Quince's certificate had passed as the only timber worth the Navy's money, she bored 11, and found 7 of them truly foul, foxy at the core. The very dote and shake the certificate cried up everywhere else, because a survey that condemned everything would have looked like what it was. But a survey that regretfully passed a remnant looked like judgment, and the remnant had been chosen to fail, so that if the board ever tested the parcel's character by its certified best, the best would confirm the worst. It was not incompetence. Incompetence scatters its errors. This was error with an architecture. Somebody had walked her forest with the king's marking iron and written its death carefully backwards, sound to the axe and rotten to the yards. And there was only one reason on earth to do such a thing. And the reason had arrived 11 days later in a letter from Worcester, offering £4,500 for 60,000 pounds of the finest naval oak standing in the Midlands. It took a purveyor to write that death. It took somebody inside the house to shape the season for it, to know the mortgages to the month, to time the offer, to stand at a grieving man's elbow and murmur that a corpse does not improve by keeping. She could not yet prove the second man. But she had grown up in a royal dockyard, where the timber frauds are older than the ships, and she knew the shape of this one the way a gamekeeper knows a snare, the condemned parcel trick, her father had called it, and he had seen it tried twice in 35 years, and both times, he said, it had needed 3 men: a crooked measurer, a soft buyer, and a friend inside the gate. So she wrapped the auger in flannel, and she asked through the housekeeper, properly, for 5 minutes of his Grace's time on the subject of the timber. And she stood in the estate room in her gray gown, with 2 years of the chase in her head, and the proof of a great fraud folded in her hand. And the Duke of Harcliffe, who had that morning received Craig's second and final offer, and Druitt's gentle advice to close with it, looked at his cousin's governess proposing to overturn the certified judgment of the king's purveyor, and said the sentence to Quince's warm back that this story is named for. And Quince laughed, and she made her curtsy, and carried her folded proof out into the wet park, past 1,100 condemned lives working their bare crowns in the wind. And here again it is worth being fair to the man at the window, because this story is not about a stupid duke. It is about the machinery of believing, which catches clever men by preference. He was 30, and drowning, and ashamed of drowning. He had been 3 years learning that hope at Harcliffe was a tax paid to disappointment. The certificate had cost him his last great deliverance, and he had, with a discipline that was the best thing in him, made himself accept it in a week, because a man bailing a sinking house cannot afford to court false hope. And here was false hope walking into his estate room in a gray gown, carrying, of all things on God's earth, an auger. To believe her, he would have had to believe that the king's officer was a felon, that the steward who had held his arm through every disaster was the felon's friend inside the gate, and that the one person in the county who could see it was the woman who taught his little cousins their French, and disbelieving her cost nothing but a sentence, and believing her cost the whole architecture of the only trust that was keeping him upright. So he spent the sentence. Men mostly do. And Mr. Caleb Druitt, who had held the door for her with his ledger eyes, walked back into the estate room and heard from the purveyor, in the comfortable tones of a joke shared between men of business, what the governess had come about. And Druitt laughed the proper amount, and said something easy about learned young ladies, and behind the smooth front of his face he began, with great method, to be afraid. Because Druitt had made in 6 years exactly one mistake, the one careful men make, he had catalogued every danger to the scheme that wore a coat, and it had never once occurred to him that the danger might wear a gray governess's gown and know more about oak than the purveyor he had bought. What Verity did next, she did because her father had drummed it into her at a soppet's edge when she was 12 years old, and sulking over a grading she had got right and a foreman had laughed at. Being right, he told her, is the cheap half of the work. The dear half is making your rightness stand up on its own legs in a room where you are not, in front of men who would rather it fell down, and the only bridge from the cheap half to the dear half is the book. So, she began the book, a plain marbled copybook, bought for the schoolroom, and into it, night after January night and Sunday after Sunday, went the chase, tree by tree, in the dockyard manner, number, stand, girth at breast height, crown, bark, the ring of the mallet, the auger's proof, depth of boring, character of shaving, sound or doted, and how far, each entry dated, each tree marked on a sketch map of the stands in her firm drawing hand, each condemned but sound tree flagged in red ink, each passed but rotten one flagged in black. And because she knew what the book would be worth if it were ever caught alone, she kept it sewn into the stuff of her work bag by day and under her mattress ticking by night, and bored her trees at first light or at the edge of dark, and pressed her moss plugs back over the wounds like a poacher. She could not do it alone, and she did not have to, because the chase had one other lover, and he had been grieving as hard as she had been working. Amos Treadgold had been woodward and head forester at Harcliffe for 41 years. As his father had been before him, he was 70 years old, built like the things he tended, and he had walked behind Quince's chainmen through November with his hat in his hands and his heart going to ash, because he knew every tree on that certificate by name the way you know children. And he could not read a word of the writing that had killed them, and when he had ventured once to say to the steward that he had never in 41 years known the chase to carry shake the way the gentleman's paper said, Mr. Druitt had explained to him kindly that the age was scientific now, and that an old man's fondness was not evidence, and Amos had gone home to his cottage and not spoken for 2 days. Verity found him at the felling of the first boundary oaks, for Crake's advance men had begun, with the Duke's leave, to open a cart road along the chase edge before the bargain was even signed, which tells you how sure the buyers were, standing at a distance watching a 200-year-old life come down. And she did not offer the old man sympathy. She offered him the one thing left on earth he could use, which was mutiny. She opened her book on a stump and talked to him for an hour in the plain language of the trade. Mallet ring and shake, and dote and shaving, and Amos Treadgold listened to a governess-grade timber like a master shipwright, with his mouth slowly opening. And at the end of it he took off his hat, which he had kept on for Dukes, and he said, So the Lord had not been asleep after all, and what did she need? What she needed was his 41 years. Together through the iron end of January and the whole of February, they crossed the survey, Amos choosing the trees whose histories he knew to the year. This one struck by lightning in the great storm and sound as a church, this one flooded at root 3 winters and gone soft, and passed by the king's own officer, Verity boring and grading and writing, and the book grew from a suspicion into an indictment. 190 condemned trees proved sound in her hand, and his 24 past trees proved foul. The pattern passed all charity, and, laid against it, in a separate ruled section at the back, the other pattern, the one that turned a fraud into a conspiracy, which they got by the oldest instrument of country justice there is, the memory of workingmen. Because the chainmen and the scribes had lodged that November at the inn in the village, and drunk there, and the innkeeper's daughter had waited on them, and Amos was godfather to half the parish, and out of a dozen small remembered things, a scribe grumbling that the gentleman marked fastest in the rain when no one could follow him, a chainman boasting that this parcel was sold before ever it was measured, and drinking the health of a Worcester alderman by name, and one bright particular thing, a village carter who had carried a locked deal box from the hall to the Worcester coach at McElmus, booked in the steward's own hand, directed to Alderman Thomas Crake, 11 weeks before the survey that Crake's letter would claim to have heard of only by trade gossip, out of such small things, dated and signed with crosses and set down fair. The back of the book assembled itself into a plain question no honest man could read without wanting it answered. How did the buyer of a condemned forest come to be corresponding with the seller's steward a season before the forest was condemned? While the book grew, the house grew colder around her, because Druitt was not a man to wait upon events. He could not get at the book, for he did not know it existed. But he could smell method in her walks, and he went for the person, because a woman's word was a cheap thing to break, and a clever woman's cheaper still. It began as weather, the way it always begins, a word here that the governess was much out of doors alone, and much among the workmen, a graver word to the housekeeper that learned young females who had followed a trade too closely sometimes suffered in their spirits, and wanted watching, a regretful murmur at the Duke's elbow that the children's lessons were perhaps the poorer for so much rambling, and that a woman who tramped a frozen forest at daybreak boring holes in his Grace's timber with a man's tool was, whatever else she might be, an odd creature to have the shaping of two young minds, and none of it was ever said as accusation, only ever as concern, which is the assassin's grammar. And Verity felt the ground go soft under her one plank at a time. The housekeeper's new coolness, the footman's new looks, an invitation to the rectory that did not come, and understood that she was in a race now, her book against his whisper, and that the whisper was faster. So she reached for the one weight she knew of in England heavy enough to anchor her side of the scale, and it cost her the hardest evening of the winter, because the reaching meant asking, and she had her father's pride like a bone in her throat. She sat down in the schoolroom on the first Sunday of March and wrote to Chatham, to Mr. Elias Warlow, Master Shipwright of His Majesty's Yard, under whom her father had served 30 years and died loved, and she did not write a plea, because Warlow was a dockyard man and pleas ran off him like rain off tar. She wrote him a survey, 14 close pages, the parcel, the certificate, the counts, the borings, the inverted pattern, the choosing of the past remnant, the Michaelmas box, the Lady Day term, for the Navy's contract list for the year's supply closed at the board on Lady Day. And after Lady Day, a condemned parcel might be anybody's firewood, all of it in the dry, grating language he had known her scribble since she was 10. And at the bottom of the last page she permitted herself 3 sentences that were not survey at all. You knew my father's eye, sir, and you told him once before the whole mast house that I had it. If I am wrong, come and shame me in an afternoon, and I will bear it. But if I am right, then the finest naval parcel in the Midlands is being stolen from the king and a good man both, under a bot certificate, and it goes to the axe for bark and firewood inside a month. And I am one governess with a copybook, and Lady Day is the 25th of March. Elias Warlow received that letter on a Tuesday. He read it twice at his desk in the mast house with the noise of the yard coming through the windows, and the men who worked under him remarked that afternoon that the master was short, which was rare. And on the Thursday, having laid his duties on his deputy and his best coat in a valise, he took the coach, 60 years old, unannounced, at his own charge, 40 miles inland in March weather, because Daniel Holt's daughter had sent him 14 pages that either proved a great fraud upon the King's Navy or proved nothing. And there was one way on earth to know which, and it turned on the end of an auger. And there was one evening in the middle of that cold fortnight that she never afterwards told anybody about, except years later, her son. And I will tell it to you, because it is the truest thing in the story. It was the evening she nearly stopped. The rectory invitation had not come. The housekeeper had that morning asked her, with terrible kindness, whether she slept well, in the tone one uses to the possibly mad, and at lessons the fierce small girl, who heard everything as children in great houses hear everything, had looked up from her copywork and asked, Is it true you are odd, Miss Holt? The maids say you are odd. And Verity had answered that all the best people were, and had kept her voice level, and it had cost her the whole of the day's strength. And that evening she sat on her narrow bed with the marbled book on her knees and looked at it and thought, clearly and coldly, the way her father had taught her to think. Nobody has asked me to do this. The trees are not mine. The Duke is not mine. If the chase goes to the axe, no living soul will ever reproach me, and if I go on, I stand to lose the only situation I have, the only character I have, and the only roof I have. For the privilege of being called mad by a county that will never know what the word cost me, and the door out of all of it stands open and is called silence. And silence is respectable, and silence is safe, and silence is warm. She sat with that door open a long time. And what shut it, in the end, was not courage, and she always said so. It was the plain dockyard fact her father had put into her marrow before she was 10, standing in the sheds among the seasoning timber, that a hidden rot does not stay where you leave it, that the knee you pass unsounded goes into a ship, and the ship goes into the sea, and 10 years on, in some gale off some headland she would never see, the rot chooses its moment, as rot always does. And men who trusted the men who grated the timber go down in the dark, believing the wood beneath them was honest. You did not walk past bad timber, not because you were brave, but because you knew where timber goes. She opened the book and trimmed the candle and entered the day's 11 trees in a steady hand, and the door called silence swung shut behind her and never opened again. He came to the inn, not the hall, because he was a methodical man and would not stand in a great house's front hall on a governess's evidence until he had made it his own, and for 2 days. With Verity stealing hours and Amos Treadgold walking him from stand to stand, Elias Warlow tested the book. He tested it the way she had prayed he would, which is to say against her, choosing his own trees, blind, ignoring her red flags, sounding and boring with his own yard-hardened hands, and grading every shaving before he would let her speak, and tree by tree the chase itself answered him. Sound where the certificate said rotten, rotten where the certificate said sound, until on the second afternoon, standing at the butt of a great condemned oak, with a clean pail shaving across his palm, the master shipwright of Chatham Yard said, quietly to nobody in particular, 35 years I have bought the king's timber, and I have seen surveys drunk, and surveys lazy, and surveys ignorant, and this survey is none of the three, this survey is bespoke. And then he turned to Verity Holt and said the thing she carried afterwards all her life. Your father graded a parcel to me once, and missed 1 tree in 200, and I never thought to see that eye again this side of the grave, and I was wrong, for it stands in front of me in a gray gown. Now take me to your Duke. Getting a governess, a Woodward, and a Chatham shipwright past a steward and into a Duke's presence unannounced ought to have been the hardest fence of the whole business, and it proved the easiest, because rank has one virtue, it opens its own doors. Elias Warlow sent up his card, master shipwright of His Majesty's Yard at Chatham, on the king's timber business, and no steward in England could keep that card from a duke selling a forest, and Druitt did not try, though he contrived to be present, standing at his master's shoulder in the estate room with his ledger eyes, when the 3 of them came in, and Verity watched the duke's face as he took them in, the old Woodward, hat in hand, the square salt-grained stranger in the good black coat, and behind them the governess he had spent a sentence on in January, carrying her flannel bundle, and she saw the sequence cross his features plainly. Surprise, then irritation, then, as understanding arrived, something that was neither, something wary and young, and almost like hunger, the look of a man who hears, against every discipline he has taught himself, the word hope come back into a room he had cleared of it. Warlow did not orate. He laid his credentials on the table and said he had examined the standing timber of Harcliffe Chase these 2 days past at his own charge on information received, that it was his professional judgment the certificate of condemnation was false, not in error, but by design, that the falsity was provable in an hour by any man with 2 hands, and that as the parcel touched the king's supply in time of war, his grace would appreciate that this had ceased to be a private disappointment and become a public matter. And then, into the Duke's dead silence, he said, "But your grace should not take my word either, for my word is only the governess's word, wearing a black coat. And the whole sickness of this business from the first is that every man in it has taken some other man's word for what stands written in the trees in God's own hand. There is a fair test, and I have brought it. Let your grace choose the trees." And that is how, on a raw, bright morning in the 3rd week of March, there assembled in the timber yard by the sawpits of Harcliffe Chase such a company as that yard had never seen, the Duke of Harcliffe in his plain coat, Mr. Elias Warlow with his instruments, Amos Treadgold and 4 sawyers, the rector and the family's lawyer, brought as witnesses at Warlow's insistence. Because a test nobody of weight watches is a test that never happened. Mr. Caleb Druitt, superbly composed, attending upon his master, and sent for by expresses that the Duke had signed himself with his jaw set, Mr. Nathaniel Quince, purveyor to the Navy Board, who arrived believing he came to settle a fuss, and found the fuss wearing the coat of the master shipwright of Chatham, whom he knew, and who did not shake his hand. The Duke chose the trees himself, as Warlow required, walked out into the condemned stands with the certificate in his own hand, no guide, and set his glove on 2 of the white-slashed giants, this one, and then, at Warlow's word, on one of the small elect the certificate had passed. And that one and the sawyers set to work. What happened next took 4 hours, and was watched in a silence like church. The first condemned oak came down thundering, and was cross-cut at the butt, and the heart of it lay open to the March light. 230 rings of it, cream pale, iron firm, without shake or stain from bark to core, timber to lay a first-rate's keel upon, and Warlow set the Duke's own hand on the auger. This was the moment Verity had told him of, the candle moment. Teach the man's hands and the head will follow. And the Duke of Harcliffe knelt in the mud in his good coat, and bored the butt of his own tree, and drew the shaving and smelled it, tannin and clean earth, and held it up and looked at it a long time. And nobody spoke. The second condemned oak came down the same, sound as bell metal through. Then the 3rd tree, the little past one, the certified best of Harcliffe, and the saw was not through the butt before the sawyers smelled it, and the cut fell open on a heart the color of a dead fox, punky and shot with white threads of rot, and the Duke did not need the auger for that one, for you could have pushed your thumb into the king's approved timber like cheese. And the Duke of Harcliffe stood up out of the mud with a sound shaving in one hand and a rotten one in the other, and turned, in front of the rector and the lawyer and the sawyers and the March morning, to Mr. Nathaniel Quince. And what was in his face was the thing Verity had seen begin in the estate room, arrived now whole, a man to whom the inside of a thing had been shown, holding the proof in his 2 hands, past all need of being told by anybody what anything meant ever again. Quince did what men of his kind do at the cliff edge, which is to talk of honest differences in the art, of the season of survey, of shake that closes in frost and opens in thaw, of samples and averages, his voice as smooth as ever but quicker, a fatal shade quicker. And Elias Warlow took out of his valleys the marbled copybook, which Verity had put into his keeping 2 days before, and laid it open on the sawn butt of the sound oak, and said, 214 borings, sir, dated, mapped, and this day twice tested blind in my presence. 190 of your condemnations proved sound. 24 of your approvals proved foul. Your errors run all one way. An error, sir, does not know compass directions. and behind the surveys, a question for a different sort of court. And he read out, slow, in the flat voice men use for charges, the matter of the carter and the locked box, booked in the steward's hand, directed at Michaelmas to the alderman of Worcester, whose regretful letter of purchase would arrive as if by chance 11 weeks later. In the silence after that reading, every face in the yard turned to Mr. Caleb Druitt, and Verity watching him, she stood by Amos at the edge of the circle. In her gray cloak, entirely still, saw the smooth front of the man hold for 3 full seconds, and saw the eyes behind it doing steward's work, casting up in one terrible instant the ledger of what could still be saved. And then Caleb Druitt did the cold thing, the clever thing, the thing his kind always does. He expressed himself thunderstruck. He said that he had trusted the purveyor's certificate as his master had, having no art to question it, that the box to Worcester had contained estate papers on a matter of bark contracts he would gladly lay before the lawyers, that he welcomed, none more warmly, the fullest inquiry, and he made his master a small correct bow, and it was beautifully done, seamless, unhurried, and it broke, for the first time in 6 years, against something it had never yet met in that family, which was a man who had stopped taking anybody's word for the inside of anything. The Duke looked at his steward for a long moment, and then he said, quite quietly, in front of the yard, "Mr. Druitt, you advised me a fortnight since to close with the Worcester offer because a corpse does not improve by keeping. You will render your books to my lawyer by Friday, and you will not sleep under my roof tonight." And then he turned his back on the man, which in that world was the whole sentence, and looked across the soppit, past the rector, past Warlow, to the governess standing gray and still at the edge of the circle, and in front of them all he said the other thing, the thing that cost him more, Miss Holt. In January I asked a question of this yard's company and did not stay for the answer. I am told the answer has been growing in this chase for 200 years. I should like, if you will permit it, to be taught to read it. There remained the race, because a fraud exposed in a timber yard is not a contract signed in London. And Lady Day stood 8 days off, and the year's lists at the Navy Board would close on it whether the truth arrived in time or sat weather-bound on a coach. What happened in those 8 days happened at a gallop, and it happened because 3 kinds of weight, which had each been helpless alone all winter, were at last in one scale together. The governess's book, which was the proof, the shipwright's name, which was the credit, and the Duke's rank, which was the door. Warlow posted to London on the next morning's mail with the copybook, the sawn sections, for he had ordered discs cut from all 3 butts, condemned sound and past rotten, each disc branded and sworn to by the rector and the lawyer, because a board that will wave away a woman's ink cannot wave away a yard of solid oak lying on its own table, and a letter under the Duke's seal requesting an extraordinary survey, and the Duke himself followed a day behind, and did the thing his father would have died before doing, which was to wait in ante-rooms. He waited in them for 3 days, a Duke among clerks with his hat on his knee, and it bought what it always buys, which is the difference between next year and now. And on the 4th day the board, moved partly by Warlow's 35 years, partly by the discs of oak on the table with the purveyor's own inverted marks upon the standing record, and partly by a Duke sitting in the anteroom like a man with nowhere better on earth to be, appointed 2 senior purveyors from the eastern shires, men with no connection to Quince, to ride down and reserve a Harcliffe chase at once, and they came. And they walked the stands for 4 days in hard weather, with Amos Treadgold guiding and Verity's map in their hands. They had been stiff about the map for the first hour, and then they had stopped being stiff about the map, and their certificate, signed the day before the feast, undid Quince's line for line, the parcel sound, exceptional, the finest standing naval oak surveyed in the Midland District these 20 years, and on Lady Day itself, the 25th of March, in the last hours of the open list, the contract for the supply of His Majesty's yards from the Chase of Harcliffe was entered, sealed, and signed, at terms which came over the term of years to £62,000. And that is the plain sum of what a governess with a copy book was worth to the house that had given her a sentence and a shut door in January. Justice, which is never as tidy in the record as in the telling, fell out this way. Mr. Nathaniel Quince was not tried. Purveyors of the board are dismissed, not hanged. When the board's own credit would bleed at a public trial, he was struck from the king's service. His certificates from 3 counties back called in for review. 2 further condemned parcels found bespoke in the same hand, and he ended keeping the books of a Bristol tan yard, which they say he did honestly, having no further margin for anything else. Alderman Thomas Craik was ruined by inches and lawyers, his advance recovered, his contracts elsewhere sifted, and the trade, which forgives sharpness but never forgives being made to look simple, closed against him inside 2 years. And Mr. Caleb Druitt's books, rendered to the lawyer on the Friday as ordered, were found to be perfect, which surprised nobody, and to disagree with the banker's own records in the matter of some £1,900 over 6 years, which surprised the lawyer not at all, and Druitt stood his trial at the summer assizes, not for the forest, which could not be fixed on him past a jury's doubt, but for the plainer, older felony in the books, and was convicted and transported for 14 years, and the last that Harcliffe ever certainly heard of him, he was keeping accounts for the commissary at Sydney Cove, in a coat too good for a clerk, under a sun he had not planned for. And now I must tell you the end you have been waiting for, and I will tell it the way it happened, which was not at a ball, for they were neither of them ball people, but in the Chase, in April, in the first full green of the year. On the morning the first contracted timber was felled. There was a small ceremony of it, as there should have been, and when it was done, and the company walked back, the Duke of Harcliffe asked Miss Holt to show him the tree by the mere that his little cousins called the climbing oak, which she had once mentioned rang the truest of any tree in the Chase, and under it, with no witnesses but the tree, he did not make a speech either. He said, "I have spent this spring learning your trade, and the first law of it, you tell me, is that the outside of a thing is not evidence, and that a man who wants the truth of a heart must ask the heart itself, properly, with the right instrument, and take the shaving that comes out, whatever it costs him. The right instrument, I am told, is a plain question, honestly turned. Will you marry me?" And Verity Holt, 26, a master shipwright's daughter with auger callus on her right palm, stood under the truest tree in Harcliffe Chase, and did the thing she had promised herself she would do if this ever came, which was to name the cost out loud before she answered, so that he should never think she had not counted it. "There are people in this county," she said, "who spent the winter saying I was odd, and there will be people who spend 20 years saying I was clever, that the governess bored her way out of the schoolroom and into a duchess's chair, that the book and the borings and Lady Day itself were a long, shrewd courtship dressed as a rescue. They will say it about my father's honest name as well as mine, and the higher you lift me, the louder they will say it." And the Duke said, "I knelt in the mud of my own timber yard in March, and read the heart of this matter with my own hands, and I have given up forever taking the county's word for the inside of anything. Let them grade us however they like. Their survey is bespoke, and I have seen the shaving. Marry me, and we will let the trees outlive the talk, which is what trees are for." They were married at Harcliffe in June, and Elias Warlow came up from Chatham in his best black to give the bride away, saying he stood where her father would have stood and counted it the honor of his old age, and Amos Treadgold, 41 years woodward, stood godfather within the year to a son. And the new Duchess of Harcliffe asked for 3 things at her own wedding feast, and not one of them was for herself. She asked that Amos Treadgold's wages be doubled, and his cottage made freehold to him and his line, because 41 years of faithfulness had been worth precisely nothing against one certificate, and that ought to be remembered in the parish forever. She asked that a plain rule be written into the estate book of Harcliffe and kept by every steward after, that no judgment upon the land, timber, harvest, beast, or man should ever again be accepted at the hall upon authority alone, however stamped, without one honest test that the master made with his own hands. And that rule is in the estate book still, and they call it the Duchess's rule, and stewards have been heard to sigh over it, which is exactly what it is for. And she asked, last, and her voice was not quite steady on this one, that the first mast oak of the contract, the great sound tree the Duke had felled with his own choice in March, be delivered to the royal yard at Chatham marked with her father's name, so that somewhere in the body of one of the king's ships, keel to truck, there should sail a tree that stood witness that Daniel Holt, shipwright, of 3 small rooms by the dockyard wall, had taught his daughter to read the inside of things, and that the reading had saved a forest, and a fortune, and a house. It was done as she asked. The timber went down to Chatham with the name cut deep in the butt, and the ship they built that year with Harcliffe oak in her bones served 40 years on every ocean there is, and was never lost, and sailors are not wrong about such things. So, I keep thinking about that first morning in the estate room, the warm fire, the comfortable man in the snuff-colored coat laughing his easy laugh, and a young woman standing in the middle of the floor with a flannel bundle under her arm and the truth of 1,100 trees in her head. Being asked what a governess could know of oak by a man 3 weeks from selling 60,000 pounds of the king's timber for firewood on a bought certificate. Because that is where it ends for nearly everybody, isn't it? The room agrees, the expert laughs, the door shuts, and the person carrying the truth walks back through the wet park alone. It did not end there this time for one reason only. She went back to the trees and made the book, quietly, in the cold, entry by entry, until the day it could not be argued with. So tell me which one you would have been, in that estate room or in that timber yard, the one who speaks up while the warm room is still laughing, or the one who keeps the book until the proof can stand on its own legs in front of men who would rather it fell down. Both of them are in this story, and they are the same woman, and only one of them was ever thanked. Next time I will tell you about a duke's aunt who advertised for a plain, sensible companion and crossed out every accomplished name on the list, and about the quiet young woman she chose instead, who noticed on her first evening that the great portrait in the dining room had been hung to face the wall, and who asked the one question about it that the whole family had sworn never to answer. And I would dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, so leave the name of your town in the comments and I will read them out. A timber yard in the March sun. A great oak lying open at the butt. 230 rings of it, cream pale and sound to the heart. A duke kneeling in the mud in his good coat. A bright shaving lifted in his fingers. And at the edge of the circle a young woman in a gray cloak, saying nothing at all, while the wind moves in 1,100 living crowns above them like the sea coming home.